violence in the spotlight. What's driving it? What role does the internet play, and can it be stopped? Joining our panel, Minister for Agriculture and Emergency Management, Murray Watt, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie, Pastor and CEO of the Wayside Chapel, John Owen, Professorial Fellow of Sport at the University of Canberra, Tracey, Holmes, and New South Wales Opposition Leader Mark Speakman. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Patricia Carvelis. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we are meeting. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Qantas is the hashtag. Please get involved. To get us started tonight, here's a question from Christoph Adelbert.
Thanks, PK. This is for the whole panel. Why is this government and the one prior not throwing absolutely everything at this epidemic of violence and brutality? Surely we're at the point now where nothing should be left off the table.
Murray Watt.
Thanks, PK, and thanks very much for the question. It's obviously the question that's on everyone's minds at the moment, especially given the horrific events we've seen of late. I guess I can only speak for our government, and Bridget obviously can speak for the former government, but we have actually invested huge amounts of money since coming to office a couple of years ago, as well as making a range of other reforms. Big changes to the family court to make sure that women and children get a better hearing than they were previously. Obviously, the changes we've made around family and domestic violence leave. But coming back to the funding question, we're now pouring $2.3 billion as a federal government over two budgets into preventing and recovering from domestic violence. But as you would have heard the Prime Minister and many other ministers say, we need to do more. Clearly, we need to do more. I want to pay tribute to the work that particularly Katie Gallagher and Amanda Rishworth have done as the relevant ministers. They've worked very closely with the sector to put together a 10-year action plan. And unfortunately, some of these issues that we're dealing with have been going on since time immemorial, and they will take time to change. There's massive cultural change that is required, particularly around the role of men in our community. There are obviously issues I'm sure we'll get into later about social media as well. I would love nothing more, and I think everyone in Australia would love nothing more than to see this end overnight. It should have ended a long time ago, but unfortunately it's going to take time, but we are up for the task. OK,
but $2.5 billion over 5 years, it's not enough, is it? I mean, given the crisis we're seeing.
Well, that's obviously something that will be considered further at National Cabinet this week.
Can you see that that's an underspending of the demand in the community?
I can absolutely see that the demand for domestic violence protection, housing, recovery services, a whole range of things, the demand is outstripping supply, putting it simply. I do think that is a serious investment of additional money that we haven't seen from any government before. I'm not trying to have a political crack here, but this government is spending more than any Australian government has ever spent on this area. But all of us need to do more. Governments need to do more. The community needs to do more. All of us need to do more, in particular, men.
Bridget, the question really did ask, should nothing be off the table, and also accountability for your government when you're in power?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think that's what being here at Q&A is so good. We don't get to just talk in sound bites. We actually get to have a decent discussion about the things that our community needs us as community leaders to have. I think it's appalling. I think we put landmark funding down when we were in government. That has been continued with this government. But when you talk to victim survivors, it is about frontline services. Where do I go tonight with my children and my dog? I can't get in anywhere, and that is actually the issue. It takes women trying and trying and trying and trying again before they eventually actually leave for good, for the safety and security of their children and themselves. And so I think there does need to be a lot more. I think you're seeing enough is enough. I think the Prime Minister had an opportunity to stand up and to listen to victim survivors and instead chose to gaslight them over the last 48 hours. And I think that's appalling. And I am happy to actually have that conversation, because if you have been through that, if you're a woman who's been through that and you are being told by a man, I've got it under control, I know what I'm doing, don't get emotional, calm down, it can trigger you all over again. And so I think there's a whole lot of things going on here. And to Murray's point, I think, you know, and I hope we get into this later on in the night about the pervasive influence of the internet, particularly on young men and women.
We need to have that conversation. But just on the point you make that the Prime Minister, you're saying, you know, has gaslit the person who's made the complaint. Murray, what? Has he handled that badly?
I don't think that's a fair characterisation of the Prime Minister's activities at all. I mean, leaving aside the enormous amount of work that he has led as Prime Minister that I've already gone through, and I might say having a parliamentary caucus with majority women for the first time in Australian history.
OK, but they're all the talking points. I'm going to cut through them because the question was specific about his interaction with this woman who organised the Canberra rally, and he wouldn't answer questions this morning in relation to
another woman,
to making a comment that he was the Prime Minister and wanting to speak. We've now seen the footage; it's been shared. He did make that comment. Should he apologise? She wants an apology.
The Prime Minister has addressed that over the course of the day, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of what the weekend was about, which was tens of thousands of Australians.
So you don't think he needs to apologise?
I just don't think we should lose sight of the key issue that everyone came out on the streets for over the weekend. I went to the Brisbane rally. I was heartened by the number of men, but I would have liked to have seen even more. And to make the accusation, as Bridget has, that the Prime Minister hasn't listened, he turned up to the rally. He spent an hour and a half listening to people, as he should. And that's in addition to the listening that he's performed and the action that he's taken.
Peter Dutton didn't go to any of the rallies. Your leader, David Littleproud, wasn't at the rallies.
Well, a lot of National Party, and if we're going to go through the rally tally, we can do that. I think the victim survivors are absolutely sick of us laying down my money versus your money, my rally tally versus your rally tally. It is actually about fixing the problem, PK. You know, we don't want to make political points, but the reality is, when I talk, it's frontline services. They promised 500 18 months ago. There are 17 with contracts of
frontline workers.
17 frontline workers, none of them in Tasmania after 18 months. And that is simply not good enough.
I do think that more of those workers should be on the ground now, and Bridget's right. We have funded and provided money to the states and territories for 500 frontline workers. Our expectation was never that they were going to be appearing immediately, but our expectation is the majority of them will be in place by the 30th of June, and we want to hold the states and territories to that.
Christoph?
Can I just say that this is not actually about politics. Every 96 hours, a woman is murdered. Those that aren't murdered suffer the consequences of a life of trauma. This is about people in government having the budgetary levers to make the decisions right here, right now, by investing more. We need more. The last national plan, the evaluation showed that only a very small amount of the metrics that were set out in terms of outcomes were achieved. We can't just wait another national plan the next 12 years or so. People are dying. We need solutions now. We need action now. Please.
So, Tracey, I'd love to bring you in here. Obviously, there's been this stoush around the Prime Minister's going to this demonstration, but that point Christoph makes is a powerful one.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, Christoph, but I think the Prime Minister has been maligned a little, and the reporting of it has missed some of the context, and unfortunately that's what happens when we hand over what we call leadership or community leadership, or, you know, problems that we need solved, to politicians, because politicians are our elected representatives. And so we actually get to call the shots. And I think sometimes we forget about that, and we forget about the power in our own hands and the power that we have, every single one of us in this room tonight, who has a local member that we can contact and say, we have services here that are really straining under the system. So you're the politicians with the money, our taxes that we've handed over. This is what we need here now because of this emergency. And, you know, the emergency of violence is spread through through many domains in society, and it's growing around the world. And so people have to get on top of this now, and we need to demand more of the people who are in the seats that we put there. Okay, and I think we need to start calling the shots again, and we need to stand up. And every time I hear somebody interviewed on television or radio or in the newspaper saying, you know, the government needs to do more, actually, we need to tell them what we want them to do. We need them to do this in our community today, because this is where it's needed.
Mark, there is going to be a National Cabinet meeting on Wednesday. Investment is going to be a big question. Do you think this sector is totally underinvested?
Look, I'd be the first to admit as a former government minister that this is an area which has seen chronic underinvestment right across the country. We have seen chronic unmet demand. The more money we can pump into this, the better, because it will save lives, and not only save lives, but those lives that are not under threat, it will improve lives. So,
you are a government minister. Do you think you underspent, you underinvested in this?
Look, I'll be the first to admit we left a lot of unfinished business. I think we did a lot in government. We doubled the number of women's refuges, for example, investing $450 million in doubling the number of women's refuges in New South Wales, another 75. We spread staying home, leaving violence right across the state. That's a scheme to have women stay in their homes with their children if it's safe to do so, rather than having to go to a refuge. So we did spend record amounts of money. We had a major reform of the criminal justice system, the first jurisdiction in the country to have a general coercive control offence, which starts the middle of this year. And we know that coercive control, as well as being obnoxious in its own right, is a precursor to domestic violence homicide. We introduced affirmative consent legislation. We made it easier for women to give evidence in court with closed courts, preventing self-represented accused direct correspondence. So we did an enormous amount.
So if you were able to go to this cabinet meeting on Wednesday, and you are opposition leader, but you have been in government, what would you be pushing for?
Well, first I'll be pushing to listen to victim survivors and listen to experts in the field. We can all sit here tonight as and offer our opinions and as armchair critics and armchair suggestions, but we've got to be listening to people.
But you're not actually
ground.
Just armchair critics. I mean, three of you can make laws.
Yeah, we can.
That's what I mean. So you've actually got a lot of power.
Yeah, but we need to be listening to people on the ground, to frontline services, who know what is needed, and that's I think our key role is to listen and act on expert advice and the advice of frontline workers.
John, I don't think you get government funding, do you, for the work that you do?
We have one government contract, New South Wales Health.
What are you seeing turn up to your doors?
Yeah, well, like everyone's saying, it all begins with listening, and we've seen by listening to the cries on the hearts of people who are coming to Wayside, is we opened up a women's space. And what we weren't ready for was the incredible numbers of women who have come to access that service in the area. And so when we talk about what can we do, I'm hearing the great sounds around how do we get more money to frontline services, because I can show you, like Wayside, there are so many frontline services that are pushed to capacity. And so when we say we're going to, I think the phrase I read earlier today was throw the kitchen sink at this, is how big a kitchen sink are we talking, and how bold a kitchen sink are we prepared to throw at this issue. You know, we've had the report from Jess Hill called Rethinking Primary Prevention, where she says we can't just kick the can down to say let's do better education at the expense of doing more keeping men accountable, where perpetrators are often incarcerated, where they come out even more highly weaponised, sadly, from our prison system, where they're not made to do behaviour modification programs. They return to their families as loaded weapons. How do we get the right supports there? How do we get men talking to men? How do we get better conversations going? And I'm glad we're talking about social media, because it doesn't take many clicks to fall into a whole bunch of incel videos where all of a sudden you're being pushed down a path where it's really hard to return from. So, you know, we need to work. I think New South Wales Police today published that they responded in the last financial year to 140,000 calls for domestic violence. That's 1 every 4 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, we are sending people into situations that most of us would run away from. And And they need to be applauded for their efforts in that. But they are just one point of that where we need to be working together for more cooperation with frontline services. How do we work closely together to say, let's take not only a bipartisan approach from here, but also between the sector, between the police force, between first responders. You know, it all needs to come together in the ways we report. We're talking about, it's not just going to be helped with increased legislation. You know, the threshold limits for some of the ankle monitor devices. You know, I can talk to you about some of the direct women I know who have had experiences of, you know, where someone's been followed, been broken into repeatedly, had very offensive writing put up on the wall that was very targeted, and it was only logged in the rush of every 4 minutes, as logged as a break and enter, not as a threat and intimidate. And so, and also even sometimes the environments, how do we work on getting better environments? We say we're under-reporting. Well, most police stations are community centres. And so you walk into a place to report, everyone in the neighbourhood knows who you are and what you're doing there. Yeah. So there are lots of ways we can work together that we can create much better outcomes for this. And I'm really, really heartened, sorry, PK, but you know, I'm really excited also about some of the opportunities that we have to be able to live in a country where half of our population doesn't feel scared.
Okay. Next, we're going to hear from Tabitha Ackett.
My daughter, McKenzie Anderson, suffered 2 years of domestic violence before her life was tragically taken. Her murder happened in slow motion through many failures of the judicial and social system, and we're still yet to reach trial. My question to the panel is, when is there going to be an inquest into the actions of judges and the judicial system for domestic violence offenders?
Mark Speakman.
Well, there are often inquests into individual cases. The state government's spending $18 million into inquest the recent alleged murder. Criminal justice, the criminal justice system is an important part of the domestic violence response, but it's probably not the major part. But I think we can do a lot more to protect victims of domestic violence, and that's why we're suggesting as an opposition that we roll out electronic monitoring for serious domestic violence charges. We've done that for parolees and those on intensive corrections orders who've been convicted, and the evidence we got last year was that led to a 33% reduction in DV offending. It's not foolproof. You know where the offender or the accused is. You don't necessarily know what they're doing. It doesn't stop internet abuse. It doesn't stop telephone abuse. It doesn't stop tracking. It doesn't stop financial abuse. But it is a way to protect against physical harm and ultimately the worst sort of physical harm. So the justice system needs to be reviewed. That needs to be on the table. Basically,
so what do you think should be on the table, the question in relation to the way the judiciary deals with these?
Well, I think that's why we need a Royal Commission. We need a Royal Commission, not to put things on halt, not to stop, because there are some things we know we can do straight away. There's a lot of evidence. We just can't have a pause for 2 or 3 years. But I think we need that independent oversight.
And you think it should be just for New South Wales, or should there be a national one?
With respect to Murray, I'm disappointed there isn't going to be a federal Royal Commission apparently, but I think that would be ideal. But if it's not going to be done federally, we'd like to see one in New South Wales.
Why do you think there needs to be a federal one? Because the government argues that they have the solutions and they just want to get on with it. Why do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't think anyone can be absolutely sure they've got the solutions. There's an evidence base still developing. I mean, men's behaviour change programs, for example, it's still a bit of trial and error there. We don't know necessarily what works and what doesn't. I think a Royal Commission would be good to have that independent oversight, not to stop things, but have that independent oversight, and also to have the gravitas for action. We saw with the Child Abuse Royal Commission, that led to enormous action. I'm hoping with the Veteran Suicide Royal Commission, that's going to lead to enormous change. So I think the Royal Commission has that potential to have that gravitas to force action.
Tabitha, I just want to go back to you because your story is just shocking and heartbreaking. I wonder how the last couple of weeks have landed on you, watching this movement.
Yeah, it's been horrible. And to watch the recent murder in Forbes of Molly, her case was almost identical to my daughter's. And obviously I can't talk much about mine because it's still an active case. But I met with Mark 2 years ago and he was condescending and dismissive of me in the meeting when I did raise that there were major failures in the judicial system. And one of his answers, without giving details, was, how violent was it? You know, so your words don't mean a lot to me. And whilst I do agree that prevention is a huge thing that we need to do, and this is a multi-layer onion approach that we need, There are many judges letting violent offenders out without intervention. I 100% agree with your comment. We need some kind of counselling in there. We need rehabilitation. I don't want to throw men out with the bathwater. We have failed them at some point, and that's how they've got there. We have to have compassion at the same time. I'm not going to become angry and bitter to all men, but what we do need to do is that we can't slap them on the wrist and say, now your life's at risk because I'm not going to actually follow through with some actions on this. And that's what upsets me greatly with that. I think that this is such a multi-layered issue and we need a lot of different approaches all at once. But the judicial system plays a huge role in it and we have to do better.
OK, Mark, obviously this was not a positive interaction for Tabitha. Do you remember it?
I do. I remember Tabitha coming to my office. If I was condescending, I apologise. I'm not trauma-informed. I do my best, but obviously, in many cases, it's not good enough.
Tabitha?
I think, obviously you've led a very privileged male life and you did the best you could in that situation, but I think you need to get much more informed.
But do you think all politicians do? As you're watching the nation and this unfold, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of privilege involved in a lot of politicians' lives. And, and I'm sure I walked with that privilege before I had to walk into this disaster as well. Unfortunately, I'm living this life and I'm seeing the failures firsthand. And unfortunately, through my experiences, I've met lots of other families in the same situations as me. And we unfortunately tell very similar stories. And that's the really sad thing is that Molly's story isn't a new story. It's the same story as McKenzie's 2 years ago and nothing changed. And McKenzie's story isn't a new story. It's the same story as 2 years before that and 2 years before that and 2 years before that. We're not making change. And that's what's really sad because I don't want to see other families experience the trauma that I have and my friends and my family. And unfortunately, I see the media, and the last 2 weeks have been very triggering for me because I know exactly how those families feel. I know their life just became ruined in a way they never could have imagined. And unfortunately, I know I might turn on the television tomorrow and the same thing and the same thing and the same thing.
Tabitha, can I say I'm really sorry to hear your story and for anybody that has had to experience that. But you're so right. And one of the things that I think is so important for everybody to hear, because I don't think the media reflects this adequately, this whole of system and the compassion element, we've seen that numerous times in recent events. But it's always downplayed in the media and it ends up becoming heavily politicised, which is just incredibly triggering for everybody who's experienced something like that. And I know I do some work as an ambassador for the Chapel Foundation, which has to do with homeless youth. And most of the homeless youth, there's tens of thousands on the street because of domestic violence at home. And so there's all of these interjections that have to work together so that we never, ever get to that point. And of course, the judicial system sits at the top of that. But that's the end of the road, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's all of these other steps in the way.
Yeah, plays a big role in this. Obviously, I've done a lot of media talking, and a lot of the times when I talk about compassion and prevention and how we can intervene, it doesn't make it to the screens. It doesn't make it to paper. They want the trauma porn from me. They want to see me crying. They want to display me on something. They want to put me up like that, but they don't want to have the real discussions. And that's really annoying, because you're there going, I actually think there's space to have compassion and there's space to have better conversations, because just saying they did everything wrong and they have to take responsibility won't fix the problem.
And
that's a
the
really
only way
powerful
things
point.
heal.
Powerful.
And trauma porn is a really good way of describing it. And I think the media has been, we know that, we're having our own reckoning about the way that we deal with these issues. The fundamental question, though, about a review into the way judges deal with these issues. Does all of that have to be on the table, and can that only be through a royal commission?
I absolutely think it has to be on the table, and thank you, Tabitha, for sharing your story. I can't imagine what you and your family have gone through since that terrible event. And I've certainly met with victim survivor organisations, women legal services, who always raise the need for more training of judges, registrars, police, politicians. We need more as well. My wife has worked in this space in a policy sense, so I guess I've benefited a little bit from that, but I'm by no means an expert. But I guess it goes to that broader point that you're making, that this is going to need such a variety of different actions. It does need more resourcing. you know, I would argue that we are providing a lot of resourcing, but it needs resourcing. It needs legislative change. It needs training. It needs housing, crisis accommodation. It needs a range of responses. And I guess the point is we've got to seize this moment and actually make this a national turning point. I feel like, you know, we've been in this place before. I'm sure all the women in the audience feel it much more deeply than I do. We cannot allow this to continue without seizing the moment and driving some change.
So how do we make it a national turning point?
Yeah, I think, Tabitha, I just can't imagine. So, and you're right, it has happened time and time and time again. And people, women, we get to a certain age and we're like, really? Really? What used to be behind the front door now is out of the front door, wasn't never reported in the media, and it is everywhere. And I think it needs to stay there until we actually get some tangible actions. And it is about the Jess Hill piece about short-term, medium-term and long-term strategies, not pouring all the money into prevention. How am I getting help tonight or this week or next week?
And can we stop the motherhood statements?
I hate
there's
the word
a lot
motherhood
of
statement because it assumes something's wrong with mothers. Yeah,
You're right.
The blanket
You're right, we should ban that. But yes,
absolutely.
We need to change in
and
50
it's cultural.
years.
Well, of course it's cultural, and that's going to take decades. So I hope I've raised my sons to not do this, and I hope we're all raising our sons and our daughters to be good men and women and not to throw masculinity out, because it is a powerful force for good in this world. And I would hate my sons to think that's a bad thing, but it has to be exercised appropriately and responsibly.
Yep.
Instead of maybe spending another $300 million on a Royal Commission that will just go to lawyers, can I suggest a few other ways we could spend it? Yeah. And we get that money immediately out because we're seeing just this increase in demand on all the frontline services that are there, on refuges. I know we are investing in them, but we've got to clear a lot of the red tape because the sector is crying out. They're crying out and they are stretched to capacity. And the stories and the women who are coming into those services, the stories they tell, are stories no one should ever have to tell.
No.
And so, you know, let's make sure we get where it's needed first.
Can I just comment on the regional piece? Because I know we're in Sydney, but if you are out in the regions, who's doing the bail? Who's the registrar on the weekend? Where is the service? It's 200 kilometres away. There's a whole raft of next layer of intractability and inaccessibility too, I think.
We're going to keep this discussion going with a question from Bianca Inglesos.
Why is violence against women not treated the same as terrorism? What's the difference between people living in fear because of their religion that they chose and living in fear because of their gender?
Murray Watt.
I've been thinking about this quite a bit over the last few days, especially since the appalling Bondi incident, which would seem pretty obviously to be involved targeting women. I realise there's got to be coronial
the police
inquiries and things
confirmed
like
that they believe
it's pretty obvious if you look at the numbers of murders involved. I'm not sure that classifying it as a terrorist offence is necessarily the way to go, but I do think that we need to examine and do something about the ideology that seems to be driving this kind of behaviour from some men. Bridget's right, we don't want to argue that all men are bad people, and I know no one's trying to do that, but there's some pretty bad elements out there, and they're flourishing. They're able to use online media in a way that was never possible before. And I've just been even thinking about the conversation tonight. Some of the solutions that people are putting up rightly are things that we've been talking about for a long time, but there are some new things on the horizon now as well. And I think the growth of those misogynistic hate groups has got to be tackled. And that is a new frontier, if you like, in this ongoing battle.
Well, I have to take you up on that because you have put forward a new idea. How do you tackle misogynistic online hate? How do you do it?
I don't pretend to have the solution to that, but I guess I'm also hoping that that's something that we might be able to deal with through this discussion that now that is underway about online media.
But if we don't have those solutions, isn't that where the Royal Commission could be useful?
No, I also I mean, National Cabinet's going to, I think, discuss a Royal Commission, but I'm not persuaded that's the way to go, and it's partly because of what John just said. And I've noticed that most of the victim survivor groups don't support a Royal Commission either. They just want action.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that many of those groups were heavily involved in the design of the National Action Plan. We need to get on and get it done and deliver it. But I absolutely acknowledge the point that you're making, that this is a new issue that we need a different kind of response to. And the Andrew Tates of this world are playing a very, very dangerous role in fostering that kind of hatred of women. And I don't think it's far-fetched to say that that sort of ideology and that sort of thinking is having some impact on some of the men who are committing this violence.
We've got Vincent Hurley in the audience. He's a criminologist at Macquarie University and a former New South Wales Police detective. Vincent, thanks for joining us.
That's right, Patricia.
You've been watching this debate and you did policing in this area for a long time. What do you think we need? Is it to classify it as a terrorist act? Is that the sort of way that we need to go forward?
Can I just make a couple of observations before I go into that? The very first question you asked the two parliamentarians, they immediately started bickering amongst each other about who had the best politics. That just goes to show the point that you are overlooking the murder of women out here. You're putting politics above these people behind me. How dare you? How dare you go into politics in an environment like this when one woman is murdered every 4 days and all you two can do is immediately talk about politics? That is just disgraceful. Is it any wonder frontline services aren't getting the money that they want? You can talk about putting out billions of dollars. AUKUS cost $300 billion. Do you think the federal government could spare a couple of $1 billion, even $1 million, for the pastor here at the Wayside Chapel? No, you couldn't. You made the comment we need to listen more. For God's sake, how long do we have to listen to politicians like you and the rest of you high-horsing about we have to have a Royal Commission, we have to do this? Everyone here knows what the answer is.
OK, so what are they? What are they?
First of all, that man should never have been released on bail. OK, that is the very first thing that happened. If a male has a history of crimes of violence, of any form of domestic violence, coercion, physical, emotional, they should not have the presumption of bail. They should not get bail at all. There will be people who vehemently disagree about the rule of law, about the right of individuals, about the innocence before guilty. But what does society want? We want those poor girls up there from those high schools. 1 in every 4 of them are likely to be sexually assaulted after the age of 15. And you all sit here and pontificate about what we're doing. You're not doing enough.
So what do they do? Should they designate it terror, intimate terror acts?
Yeah, there's enough legislation there for police to go and arrest them. New South Wales Police have had a pro-arrest policy for at least 30 years, and we cannot arrest our way out of this. But for the immediate concern of the women here, they need to have that offender taken off the street to give them breathing space to get away to a women's refuge. Over the decades, all governments of all persuasions, state and federal, you have patient dumped people with mental health and drug issues onto the street, which are the underlying causes of domestic violence. And I know, because I've read 1,362 coroner's reports in New South Wales over the last 20 years, and that is the common element. So you talk about domestic violence. It is more than just domestic violence. You don't need a Royal Commission. That money needs to go into frontline services now.
Vince, I know you worked in this area for a long time and you're very passionate about it. We invited you on because we wanted to hold them to account because they can actually make laws. You're in government, but, you know, you've been in government and obviously you've got a crucial position in the Senate as well where you can really influence things. Do you understand Vince's anger? I mean, he feels
Sorry, Patricia. I went to 20 domestics in one night when I was in the police. I was stationed at Mount Druitt, Blacktown, St Mary's and Penrith. And you could not imagine, unless you've been the victim of domestic violence, I held a 10-year-old child in my arms who died from stabbing from her father. okay? You have no comprehension unless you have been in that situation. But to get up here and say that we need to do this and we need to do that, I think it's just... it's offensive to these people here.
OK, I'll give you a right of reply, Murray.
Well, thanks, Vince, and I acknowledge your incredible experience, which goes well beyond mine, and that's obviously informed your views on this. You know, I do think it's important to inform the public about things that have been done, acknowledge that more needs to be done, and talk about the kind of things that should be done now. And that's, I guess, what we've tried to do tonight. Specifically on the legal changes, obviously a number of them would need to be made at a state level, but I think this is a conversation that's going to be happening this Wednesday at National Cabinet. That's the point of getting the Prime Minister and every Premier or Chief Minister together to talk about what might need to change in the laws at state and federal level as well.
Vince.
Well, you do. You need to reach agreement with we can't. We don't legislate on this. We need to reach
All right.
Vince,
Bridget?
you know, I have never been a frontline emergency service personnel, so what you've had to deal with in your time in the police force, along with all victim survivors, their children, their family, the flow-on effect, the impact's obviously phenomenal. And no one wants to take that away, and it doesn't just impact the person that the crime is perpetrated against. I think everybody that I know that gets into politics actually wants to make a change. Is it harder than we thought it would be when we started? Yes. Does it mean we still keep trying? Yes. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm sure most of the MPs that I work with on both sides do not want to see this to continue, have had enough, and want to do what we can to make a difference.
If this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, and I know given this issue touches so many people, it has, the numbers for 1800 Respect and Women's Crisis Line are there on your screen, and I urge you to use them. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A Live with Murray Watt, Bridget McKenzie, John Owen, Tracey Holmes and Mark Speakman. Now, I'd like to bring in Millie Fontana.
Thank you, Patricia. And I'd just like to say thank you to Vince down the front there for his valuable input in highlighting the fact that we are actually up against a mental health crisis that is not just exclusively men, it's women as well. And what is driving our young men to commit these violent acts? You'll find it's societal pressures at large. And Joel Couchy was a known schizophrenic that slipped through the cracks, the Bondi incident. So my question is for Bridget McKenzie, and I suppose the two issues do intersect in regards to domestic violence. Amidst all the social and political pressure to crack down on Elon Musk, do you think that the coalition could at least give the public some safeguards that our freedom of political expression will be preserved going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Millie, for your question. It's a national sport to pile on to billionaires, and we'll park that. But I think one thing that social media has allowed is the public square is now open for everybody for a whole range of very diverse views. And I would hate to see any crackdown on violent pornography or online misogyny to actually mean that legitimate political views of difference in a country as diverse as ours aren't able to be expressed. I think one of the concerns I've had over the last few months in particular, particularly since October 7, is the level of disparate views and how they're being expressed in our multicultural country, and the level of, you know, the breaking of our social cohesion, which has sort of led to our success. That means we have to be able to express our ideas respectfully. We have to accept that people legitimately can hold an opposing view, and it doesn't mean they're stupid and it doesn't mean they're wrong. And if we're going to actually want to continue to have the vibrant society that we do have, we've got to allow for that. And I'm concerned if we go too far with censorship, we won't have that platform for expression available to us.
Tracey, there is a big debate now about what goes on X and whether we should be doing more regulating of the internet. What's your view?
I don't agree with any kind of censorship in a general sense. I don't think Elon Musk is contributing to any social cohesion split inside this country. I think our media, our mainstream media, is doing enough of that. I think our politicians do enough of that. When you talk about people being able to have different perspectives and different points of views, and it's okay to have that, and yet we don't see that in politics ever. We don't see it in mainstream media. We see this absolute divide to the point where people are starting to think that when they read in the newspaper that it's unsafe for women to walk down the street in this country, people start believing it. And that kind of fear is what is leading to social cohesion breakdown in this country. We have to stop the fear. And whoever's doing the fear-mongering is what we've got to stop.
I just want to take you to the women feeling safe, because a lot of women are expressing that, especially after the murder of that woman in Ballarat who was just going for a jog in the morning. I mean, it's just unthinkable, and I know Ballarat's really suffered so immensely recently. That's where some of that comes from, doesn't it?
It is, but it's not, you know, when we read reports that women are too afraid to walk down the street, I know lots of women that are not too afraid to walk down the street. I know there's a lot of men who have our backs. You know, that is the society we live in. We look at the people that you know, tried to rush forward at Bondi. You know, the guy that stood at the top of the escalator.
Bollard man.
Yeah, exactly.
As
I
he's
mean,
known.
you know, we don't live in a society where we all turn a blind eye. We absolutely don't. And I really get so... I don't like being enraged, because I think that just leads to more splits, and we have to have these discussions with a sense of... you know, trying to remain calm and have the proper discussions. And it does get me really angry when I see that our society is reported as having all of these major fault lines. Of course, there are fault lines everywhere, but there's only one way that you can stop those fault lines from getting even bigger, and that is to have the ability to have the town square, to hear different points of view, and people will choose for themselves. The public is not stupid. And unfortunately, I think we've been fed, you know, this side or that side in the mainstream media for so long. People are giving up on mainstream media. That's why they're tuning out. That's why they're going to YouTube. You ask many of the young people, they're getting their information from social media because of that, because we have let them down.
Let me just ask you, Mark Speakman, that's really your question at the heart of it, is this dispute with the e-Safety Commissioner, with Elon Musk and the implications. Do you think that that footage of that attempted murder, really, that stabbing in Western Sydney should be pulled down across the world?
Not across the world.
Why not? Why not across the world?
Well, I don't think Australia has any business in exercising takedown powers in other countries, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we say we're entitled to have takedown orders apply across the world, well then China or France or Paraguay comes back to us. We'd have to accept what they're doing as well. So I don't think it has to be worldwide. I do think on balance that particular video should be geo-blocked in Australia for what it's worth. I mean, there are limits on how effective that can be. On the night that it happened, I stumbled across it. I wasn't looking for it, but I found it. I found it quite disturbing. But you know, things like that which incite violence or can incite you know, extreme violence, I don't think should be on the internet. That said, I agree with Tracey. I think we've got to have a light touch on censorship. At the end of the day, in terms of speech, free speech should be the default position, and the best way to root out a view that is wrong or misinformation is to expose it by argument rather than trying to ban it.
OK, but at the same time, you've said, for instance, that you want to crack down on misogynist content online. What do you think, Bridget? Should that be pulled out?
Well,
misogynist
this is
content
the great
online?
debate, right?
It is.
Who's going to determine what is able to be seen and what isn't able to be seen? I do back the e-Safety Commissioner's recommendation to put age verification on, you know, violent pornography, misogynist content and violent videos. I think our young people shouldn't be able to see that. It was one of her strong recommendations. We back it, and we hope the government comes and backs us with that, particularly in the light of you know, particularly violent pornography and the impact, the flow-on impact that has over an individual's
Murray,
lifetime.
is that something you back?
Well,
perspective of women.
All of those things are right now under review, and you know, there will be changes as a result of that. I do want to pick up this point that there are people who are trying to conflate restriction on social media around offensive, violent content with freedom of expression. We have always had restrictions on freedom of expression, defamation laws, treason, contempt of court. You know what? We have classification systems when it comes to movies, TV shows.
But there's always debates around that.
There are. And
I just think that it's worth noting that Australians typically don't like being told what to do by foreigners, and foreigners really don't like being told what to do by Australia. Do you actually think that bringing in an American e-safety commissioner to govern all of these laws is wise and also palatable to the public, given our concerns about our ability to express ourselves as a democracy?
Okay.
Well, I don't think anyone's talking about bringing in an American e-safety commissioner. We've got an Australian one who should govern and have the ability to regulate content within Australia. There's obviously...
You mean her accent, but she's an Australian.
Well,
she's an
yeah,
Australian.
I mean, I don't think we need to have a crack at someone about their accent. I mean, she's the Australian e-safety commissioner. I mean, I would like to understand why anyone thinks, or why Elon Musk for that matter, thinks it is okay to share the kind of material that his platform has been sharing. How does that help anyone? We've always restricted movies, which the community thinks go too far, TV shows as well, and I mean...
Why are you passionate about this, Bridget?
Yeah, I am.
You are, but why?
I am, and I have been... I was moved not by the alleged stabbing. I was moved by Bishop Emmanuel's prayer for the perpetrator. I thought that was an amazing display of his Christianity in just a moment I couldn't imagine. I know we can get on the internet and we can see JFK's murder, we can see the atrocities of the Holocaust. That is there to remind that 11th of September, 9/11. All of these atrocities of humanity are able to be viewed to remind us how bad we can be.
So you think this should be available?
I think that it's appropriate to sometimes have these horrific images and instances
Including
available.
this one? Should it be available in Australia in your view?
I think that Australian laws should be complied with in Australia.
Do you support those Australian laws being used to pull the video down in Australia?
And that's what's being tested before the courts right now. Was it reasonable efforts by X to block that particular video by geo-blocking it? That's the question before.
Why would you block that?
It's geo-blocked.
But have you watched the 7 p.m. news every night? And we see what's happening in Israel and Gaza?
Yeah.
Seriously? We're not blocking that, are we? How horrendous is that?
And could you imagine being that victim's
Okay.
family and seeing that?
All right.
Of your family?
Let's just... OK, so you think there's a double standard?
There's a double standard. There's absolutely a double standard. I've got neighbours who have family in Lebanon and relatives in Gaza, and every single night we're seeing that. That's real. That's not just someone over there, somebody different. You know, this is the stuff, and if we don't see it and we don't understand what's happening in our world, how do we ask the right questions in order to fix it?
I guess, and Tracey and I were having a bit of a chat about this before we came on air as well. I guess the difference that I see is that mainstream media are expected to comply with particular journalistic and other standards. Until the e-safety commissioner has got involved, the online space has been completely unregulated, and I don't think that's okay. And you know, we've spent most of the night having a discussion about what is influencing male violence in particular, and I think most of us can see this is playing a role. I don't think we can sort of say that on the one hand and then not do something about this as well.
OK. No, we're actually going to move to another question, if that's OK, because there's a lot to get to tonight, and I think lots of our questioners should have a go. Our next question is from Christian Kardam.
In light of the recent Chinese doping scandal, how can we make sure that the Olympics are fair for everyone, and how can we extend this to all competitive sports effectively?
Tracey.
Over to you.
Yeah. Fairness is kind of an interesting concept, isn't it? But I guess the only way you can do it is to actually have faith in the systems that have been put in place. At the moment, when we're talking about doping, we know there's the recent scandal with the Chinese doping. There is so much to that story that we don't know yet. And again, there's been a lot of very selective reporting on the way that story was done. It's very easy if you're talking about Chinese to just say, well, they're all guilty because they've done it before. And yet whenever any of our athletes test positive, they're all innocent because, of course, why would we cheat?
But so again, our athletes usually stood down, it's publicly known. There has been something different about what's happened here.
There has been something different about this, and if you look at the facts that WADA has put forward, and that is being investigated now, there's an independent investigator that is looking at the way this case was handled. What was different about this was that when WADA was alerted by the Chinese anti-doping authority that 23 athletes had tested positive all in one hotel, and the positive tests were random. They were all over the place. They were positive one day, negative the next, positive again the next day. It was what looked like was consistent with a contamination event, which is what, with the difficulties of COVID at the time, people not being able to go into the country at the time, there were all of these other complicating factors. But WADA asked for the case file. That's the World Anti-Doping Body. They went through it with as fine a tooth comb as they could find, given the situation at the time. They spoke to other experts. They took legal advice, anti-doping legal experts. All of them looked at it and said, even if you decided to challenge this in a court of arbitration for sport, you would have less than 1% chance of winning because there is no evidence to support anything other than the finding they came up with. And so the difference being, of course, lots of people have raised athletes like Shayna Jack.
Yeah.
And I've also, you know, all the way through thought Shayna Jack was very hard done by, but hers was a different circumstance. She had taken a supplement which they believe was contaminated. Okay, these Chinese swimmers weren't taking supplements, it was contamination in a random event at the hotel. And so there are different scenarios there that haven't been pulled apart.
Brief answer on this, because I want to get to our next question. But Bridget McKenzie, do you think it's an even playing field? Our athletes are right to go and
the glory of that gold medal at an Olympic or a World Championship is everything, and our athletes, like athletes around the world, train their whole life for that opportunity. And you know, when you listen to our athletes that swam in that games, and the heartbreak and the anger. They're prepared to lose, but they want to lose to the best, not to the drugged. And I think that is the great tragedy if you can't have faith in the institutions. Tracey makes a good point about China v. the world. When I was Sports Minister, RUSADA, the Russian Union Anti-Doping Association, there was a big case before WADA then, and listening to international athletes speaking in very similar ways about needing the system to have integrity was important. I love sport, and we're a nation that loves sport, and we need to make sure that we lead the world in a lot of these things. So Sport Integrity Australia and ASADA sort of led the world in integrity matters domestically, and we need to make sure we're at the forefront of the international conversation going forward.
And can I just say that, you know, our athletes train incredibly hard to win their gold medals. So do athletes in every country in the world. And you might not know this, but at the moment there are 23 Australians serving anti-doping suspensions right now. OK? So we don't talk about them. We probably can't name any of them. But there are 23 serving suspensions at the moment through Sport Integrity Australia. So it's not just everybody else that cheats, OK?
Although we're the best and we should win the most gold medals.
I was thinking that would be a way to make
I'm so parochial. Next is a question from Delia Leung.
Hello. CSIRO has determined nuclear power does not currently provide an economically competitive solution in Australia. So why do we even consider it?
Mark Speakman, I'll start with you.
Thanks.
Well, your previous New South Wales government was seen as really, you know, leading the country in many ways on a lot of these sort of climate change policies. Do you think there's a place for nuclear?
Well, I don't think we should rule it out. I don't think any technology should be off the table. And if there's a ban at the moment, as there is, that ban should be lifted. That said, most experts will say that it's at least 15 or 20 years before you could get a nuclear facility up and running in Australia. We know we are facing enormous challenges in getting clean, reliable, ample, affordable energy supply in the next few years. We can't wait for nuclear, so in the meantime, here in New South Wales, we should be going ahead with our electricity roadmap, which will have heavy reliance on renewables.
And so, do you think it's worth pursuing it as a sort of policy, as the federal government is doing? Federal opposition is?
Technology can change, costs can change, so there should not be a ban on it. But in the meantime, because there is an urgency in making sure we've got clean and reliable and affordable energy, we need to get on with the rollout of renewables.
One thing that doesn't change is what do you do with the pollution that's from it? You know, where do you store that? That's not going to change.
Well, that's a fair point, but that's a point for independent assessment, environmental assessment in the future. It's not a reason to put it off the table now.
Okay. Bridget, there's obviously a big debate in your party about this.
There's no debate in my party about this.
Just about where to put it.
No debate.
Is there really? No debate?
PK,
There's a debate.
I was at COP28 in Dubai in December, where the IPCC, the IEA, has said for the globe to get to net zero by 2050, nuclear has to be part of the solution. We need to triple nuclear energy production globally to actually get there as a globe. Now, we are kidding ourselves if we don't think our country, with an AUKUS alliance, is not going to be have nuclear over coming decades. That is going to be a reality. We think it should be part of the mix to 2050, absolutely, because renewables aren't going to be able to
Who's going to have it in their
all.
backyard? And when are you going to tell us where the sites will be? Because
well, we will be
want
announcing our policy well in time for the next election,
and will you
including
be specific about
including locations. But the fact is, Labor's target, we're not going to get to their target by 2030. And so to say it's not going to be able to be delivered, for 10 or 15 years, we want this to have cheap, reliable energy. AEMO, the Grattan Institute, everybody says the path we're on, 100% renewable, will not work. We will not get there. We will have blackouts. It's not McKenzie saying it.
No,
it's not the National Party. It's the experts.
The economic part of the question there, that no one is saying that this is a cheap solution or that it's a fast solution.
Well, nor is 100,000 kilometres of new transmission lines either that don't have social licence, that are going to cost a fortune, and you can't get through the planning
laws. But if you're struggling getting social licence for those transmission lines, how are you going to get them for nuclear reactors?
Well, I think the Australians...
But honestly, it's a fair question about...
I know which faction everybody's in the audience now. But
the faction PK asked a good question.
No, PK, the fact is that those countries, like all our G20 competitors globally, you want a manufacturing industry, the G20 are either have nuclear or are in the plans to actually get it set up, except for us. Germany, France, Canada, America, the UK.
Germany just shut them.
Yes. I don't know which untruth to pick up on there, because... and Peter Dutton was picked up on this in Insiders. He's been making the claim that all the G20 countries have nuclear...
No, not all the G20. I said, or on a pathway to get it.
Germany is getting out of it. Italy is getting out of it. Indonesia doesn't have it and doesn't have plans to.
Yes, it does.
You say 100,000 kilometres of transmission lines. Last week it was 28,000 was the claim being made. It's actually 4,000 till 2030. But,
Murray...
Patricia, you make the good point that...
I'm talking about the difficulty of the social licence.
Well, you make a good point. There is a debate on in the National Party and the Liberal Party at the moment about this, particularly about the locations, because they are the new NIMBYs. They don't want nuclear in their backyards. They want it everywhere else, but not in their electorate. I mean, scientists took 13 years to split the atom. Peter Dutton has managed to split the coalition on this in 13 days. 13 days.
He has. Murray,
that's efficient.
When are you going to front up after report after report, energy expert after energy expert says you are not going to meet your 2030 emissions reduction targets or your renewable rollout for 2030?
Well, the Nationals never wanted an emissions reduction target and still don't.
So what I'm going to do is press park and we're going to revisit this with you two, because boy, oh boy, wasn't that...
I'd love to have another discussion about nuclear.
All right, we'll do it.
Me too.
That's good. You're both enthusiastic. I want to finish tonight's discussion with a question from Michael Small.
In the shadow of the murders and terrorism on our doorstep, what can we do from a biblical perspective to allay the quiet, understandable anxiety and fears of so many people?
John.
Well, I think I'll take that one. So,
I reckon that one's definitely for you. I'm not going to ask
the
them.
Chinese doping question, but thank you for the question. And to say that the role that ritual plays is a very deep one for us all, particularly when society has experienced crises like we have. All our simple answers and understandings of the world tend to break down and break away. And, you know, to quote the great Nick Cave, he sees that his attendance at church and worship is an opportunity for him to be able to lay down his burdens, to be able to take his hurts to a place where, as ministers, we have many rituals where we can help make people comfortable in the not knowing, in the confusion, and can help guide us through to a new understanding of what is possible for us once again as a society. And that's a really important process, because in the absence of that process, as Victor Turner talks about it in the ritual process, is if we don't go through that well and are guided through that, we'll end up becoming more and more fundamentalists, saying let's go back to a vision of what the world once was, where we know that doesn't work and it's what is breaking down. So yes, as a minister of religion, that is, you know, I was at Bondi Beach last Sunday night, and I was part of a service where we began with song, we lit candles, we heard beautiful speeches that told us about who we are and who we aren't, and then we finished with some wonderful song from the choir of the Cafe of the Gate of Salvation, and you could see it was an opportunity to name our hurts, to name the pain that occurs in the world as it is, but also to hold a faith in the world as it could be as well. So yeah, thank you for the question.
And thank you, John, for that answer. And to everyone, I hope you have a great Orthodox Easter this weekend. It's Greek Easter this weekend, on that note. And that's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Murray Watt, Bridget McKenzie, John Owen, Tracey Holmes and Mark Speakman.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your stories and questions. Good night. Thanks, guys.
Who is going to help me and be in the